We'll break down all angles of the colossal law enforcement failure that took place during the attempted assassination of Donald Trump with Sheriff David Clarke on this episode of United Patriots Uprising with Gary Benford. I'm your host, Gary Benford. Thanks for joining us. This podcast is available at radioinfluence.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. You can find the video version at Rumble, YouTube, and Conservative Television of America. Either way, please subscribe, hit the notification button, tell your friends about the show. You know, we've had a bunch of things going on in this country for a while, and you'd think you've seen it all. But there's a game called Donkey Kong, a video game that said, how low can you go? Well, this is pretty low. But is this it? Can we get any lower than what we saw on that fateful Saturday where we almost lost President Trump? That much is all it's going to take, everybody. Well, America's sheriff has some strong feelings on this topic, and he's ready to tell us about it. Are you ready to hear it? Well, if so, let's get into it. He's a political strategist, author, writer, keynote speaker, radio and television talk show host, and media personality. Now retired after serving almost 4 decades in law enforcement, he's got a special way to reach out to each American where he gets you to understand the point and keeps the main thing the main thing. And welcome back to the show, the now retired law officer, author of the best-selling book, Cops Under Fire, current host of the podcast, Straight Talk, with America's Sheriff, David Clarke. Sheriff David Clarke. Glad to have you back, David. How are you?
Thanks a lot for that wonderful introduction. I'm humbled by that. I've been doing great. I'm on a new mission now, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
We will get into that. Well, let's get into this. You know, there used to be a time, I remember, when people respected the police, when people respected law enforcement officers, and when we always thought all branches of law enforcement, which would include everything, you know, if you want to go to Secret Service, FBI, CIA, everything was working for we the people and to keep us safe on all accords. Before we totally get into how this is unraveled and why, what did you see from what happened 2 Saturdays ago? And what would you like us to know from your point of view, how it looked?
Sure. You know, it was obviously a colossal failure all the way around. But I always say that when you have an instance such as this, it starts at the top. I think you saw a failure of leadership. You heard that the other day when now former Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle took the stand and it was a pathetic performance. And you could tell right there, and I said this before she testified, that when you start looking at the failure all throughout that organization, now it starts at the top. There's a culture problem within the Secret Service. That is nothing new. She's been there about 2 years and has done nothing to address the culture within that organization. Instead, she's been on a social construct. She's been on a social engineering experiment with this so-called 30 for 30, where she wants to make sure that 30% of the agents within the Secret Service are female by the year 2030. That's not their mission. Got way away from their mission. And when you do that, things like this happen. So this was predictable. We've heard other stories recently about Secret Service agents who have kind of gone astray. There were a couple in Latin America on an advance mission, and they were arrested with prostitutes. There was another agent who lost his gun in some bathroom somewhere. You know, so you could see it coming. And I remember those instances when they were talked about. You could see this day coming.
Well, you know, the thing that really was shocking to me was when they leaked or announced that there had been Iranian death threats. In other words, they were expecting Iranian forces to try and take President Trump out. Wouldn't you think in lieu of that, that would have put the pressure on to make sure if you're not concerned about some whacked out 20-year-old kid, that if the real threat, and by the way, as you know, they never tell you about threats that they stop. They don't want to announce them in advance, but they, once that got out and they knew about it in advance, shouldn't that have made this a very high alert?
You should have, but we've never seen that from these federal agencies. And, I'm not here to second guess, but, like my podcast, Straight Talk, I don't sugarcoat things. If I see some issues and some problems, I'm going to bring them out. That's the only way we can go about fixing these things. It's the way I ran my sheriff's office when I was a sitting sheriff in Milwaukee County. Now, backing up just a little bit, these guys, let's be honest, whether it be the FBI, whether it be the Secret Service, our intel agencies, they're just not that good at what they do. Now, what's my basis for that? Just go back to 9/11. All right. Those hijackers were on no-fly list. They were coming in and out of the United States on commercial airlines. The FBI knew about it. The CIA knew about it. They exchanged information. They passed it off. And just like we're talking about what happened a couple Saturdays ago, nobody reacted. Nobody did anything about it. There was no sense of urgency. There was complacency that sets in. And when that complacency sets in and a leader, the leader of the organization, doesn't recognize it, well, then this is what happens. And, things fall apart. Fortunately, unfortunately, the retired fire chief lost his life. Two other citizens attending a rally were hit by gunfire. And fortunately, President Trump, former President Trump, his life was spared because of his own quick action. But like I said, when they start backing up to that day there, you could see the complacency. You can see the lack of attention to detail. You can see the unprofessionalism that had set into that agency, and it was on full display that day.
I hear you, Sheriff Clarke, and basically from what you're saying, the question isn't why did this happen. Sounds like what you're saying. The question is why didn't this happen sooner? Because between 9/11 and this, it sounds like if complacency and if they've changed over some, they put the DEI in and different hires and certain things. And if you're saying that it's never really been safe, it's a blessing. Are you saying it's a blessing that this hasn't happened more often?
Yes, and if it wouldn't have happened that day at that event, it was eventually going to happen because of, like I said, when you look at the things that were going on within that organization, the Secret Service, oftentimes people don't realize these things don't happen in a moment like that day. There was the system was blinking red within the Secret Service. There were red flags all over the place that they lost their edge, that they become complacent, that they weren't paying attention to detail. They weren't taking any intel or information that was coming in very seriously. And, when that happens, it was a disaster in the making, and people shouldn't be surprised. Like you just mentioned, it's amazing it didn't happen sooner. It was going to happen anyway. It's the same. I use 9/11 as the benchmark here. All right. The system was blinking red. The intel agencies knew Osama bin Laden was planning an attack on the United States. They knew they had intel that they were going to use airplanes. And after 9/11, when it had the 9/11 Commission, and I read the report, some of the most boring reading I've had to do. It's about a 900-page document. I actually had to read it as part of my master's degree program at the United States Naval Academy postgraduate school. So I read that report, and you could just see when you read it, yep, and then all of a sudden 9/11, bang.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. I've had a guest on that was a Secret Service agent, and right now he's doing schools and he's protecting a pastor, a very famous pastor out in California. And what he told me was these things, these things are stopped well in advance. In other words, as you said, the pre-preparation that goes on weeks in advance, checking out all sight lines and everything that they go through, you have that place locked down even before, so it's amazing to me that somebody could get up on a roof and everybody's pointing and everybody's seeing this, that, and the other thing, and nobody saw him carry a gun, or he wasn't the gun, they didn't see it in his hand. Then you have the situation where, well, you had a ladder, but it wasn't with him, according to what Christopher Wray said today when he was getting grilled. And people see him, and I just want to know, as a law enforcement officer and somebody that has been involved in this thing, shouldn't, if the main thing is protecting the president, he doesn't get on the stage, or as soon as you hear or understand there's a possibility of a threat, you get him off the stage?
Yes, I should add this as well. I was trained in dignitary protection by the United States Secret Service. It was a 2-week course out in Washington, D.C., and they took us through every aspect of the event planning and the actual protection. So I know the model, I know how it works, I know what they do, I know what they should do, and I know from that what they didn't do when I use that to analyze what happened a couple of weeks ago. So I have some background in dignitary protection as trained by the Secret Service. But again, I'll go to, back to those two things, those two key elements: a lack of a sense of urgency and no attention to detail. Okay, you're right. They had many opportunities that day. We can talk about some of the things that were going on in the past culturally in that organization that were wrong. And it starts with the hiring. Who are you hiring, for heaven's sakes? They were hiring for gender instead of hiring for the best qualified people. And so you get people into the organization. It's not that they're bad people. They're fine people, but they're not a good fit. This is not for everybody. And you have to maintain high standards to go in. But instead, what they did was drop the standards. And, the military is doing this too, but today, by the way, dropping the standards for people to qualify, lowering the bar so they can get over it. That's not what you do. But getting back to the events that day, it was a chain of events that led to this. It's a series, and every one of these instances is a link in that chain. And all you have to do is interrupt one of those links, and you stop an attack. Just like with 9/11, they had a chance to interrupt that thing well in advance, not just that day when the planes are hijacked. Because once the planes are hijacked, or once that guy gets off shots, it's too late. So, it seems to me that the shooter did better advanced planning than the Secret Service advance team. That's pathetic.
Yeah. Well, before we move on, there's one aspect about this that really bothers me. And my background, I have no background in law enforcement. I do have a cousin that's a police officer in Atlanta, has been for a long time. But I've had quite a few. I have friends who are former FBI, CIA, naturalization services and stuff, ICE. I've talked to a lot of people about a lot of things. And there's one thing that is very troubling to me that nobody talks about. At least I haven't heard it. That iconic picture with President Trump's hand up in the air that we all love. Tell me what you think. That picture should never have been taken, because President Trump's head should not be exposed. They didn't know if there was any other shooters there. They had no way of knowing how many shooters were there. While he's going like this, somebody could have blown his head off. Am I wrong?
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're iconic pictures, and the bravery and courage of the president under fire, literally not.
They have to cover him, right?
But the procedure should have been, they call it the huddle. The agents, they form like a huddle, like a football huddle around the protectee. That's what they call him, the protectee. And they cover him completely. They kept letting him get up and throw the fist. Hey, I know, there's a lot going on. They failed in that part too, because they didn't know that the threat had been neutralized, that the guy who shot him had been killed. And so, those make for iconic pictures, but at the same time, policy was violated, practice was violated, procedure was violated.
Can you be that incompetent?
Sure. Yeah. They rose to their level of incompetency. That's why I said, go back to the hiring. Hiring people, you're ideally for these types of assignments, ideally, you don't always get the ideal, but ideally, you want people with law enforcement background, military background, People have been in a fight before. Many of these agents, they come in from the private sector. They were accountants, or, they were working in business offices. A lot of them have never even been in a fight, for heaven's sakes. A cop has been in a lot of fights, rolling around on the ground, trying to get somebody in handcuffs that doesn't want to go in handcuffs, getting shot at, things like that, that these guys have never experienced. And there is no, um, there's nothing better than experience when it comes to these situations. So, and like I said, it may sound like I'm second guessing, but I don't care, because I know what should have happened. I've been trained in this. I have worked presidential protection details, numerous ones, as the commanding officer working with the Secret Service. That's why I was trained by them, so that I understand what they do and why they do it, so that when the stuff is going on and they say, hey, Captain, I was a captain with the Milwaukee Police Department, the commanding officer of the intelligence division. We need this. We got this over here. Communication is key. Communication has to flow quickly to everybody involved in the incident, up, down, and across the spectrum. And then action has to be taken off that information. None of that happened. I'm not going to sit back here now and go, well, yeah, and kick the dirt and, they did the best they could. No, they failed. And yeah, people are saying it now, and Cheadle, Director Cheadle, said it now. It's too late now. We know it failed. We saw it.
Right on national TV. Well, let's get to this show is a keep it real show, so let's get down to the nitty gritty. I know both of us lived through a time in which police were respected, in which the policemen were your friends, and when did you start seeing this go wrong, and how and why did it go wrong?
This is a new phenomenon. It really is. I was through 4 decades in law enforcement. The late 70s, I became a street cop in 1978. So I was in the late 70s. I was all through the 80s, all through the 90s, and a good part of 2000. I retired in 2017. So I saw this gradual erosion of respect for police. But you know where it starts? It doesn't start on the street. It starts in the home.
There you
It
go.
starts in the homes. You got these young punks out there today who don't respect their parent, because there are very few parents, the plural. They don't respect their teachers. They don't respect their neighbors. They don't respect much. And so that transferred down. Why the heck does anybody think that they're going to respect the police? Nobody. And that, again, there's a linkage here. And it just gets passed on. Like I said, they don't respect their parent. They don't respect the teachers in school. They don't respect their neighbors. And then all of a sudden the police get them, and the police are going to demand respect. The other ones get to back away, right? Parent goes, and I've been to these assignments as a street cop, uniform cop. He won't listen. I talk to him and he won't listen. Okay, you go to the schools, the teacher gives instructions. The same kid who doesn't respect his parent, doesn't respect the teacher gets to pass it on. They call the principal. The principal says, there's not much I can do, let's call the police. All right, so it gets to the police, but the police can't pass it on to anybody else. The police are going to have to demand respect. The police are going to have to enforce respect, and usually that means a confrontation. And when that happens, for the most part, for the perpetrator, this out of control kid, things aren't going to end up well for him.
Okay, so we understand that, and did it start like in the 80s, because it seemed to me all of a sudden, well, I can no actually it had to be the 70s, because when I was growing up police were well respected, yet when I was at Ohio University and in college in the early 70s, all of a sudden we're calling cops pigs. Did it come in the 70s, and what perpetuated the switch where all of a sudden we could call police names and think that either that was cool or that they were the problem instead of us?
Yeah, a different dynamic than what, the ones with the young thug on the street. What you're talking about is it started in the colleges and universities in the anti-war movement.
So that's where, yeah,
You know,
Vietnam.
this was right. This was a subversive movement. The police were viewed by these idiotic, mindless college students. They were viewed as the man, the establishment. They were a part of the government they were rebelling about and rebelling against, but the cops are on the front lines. The cops are on the street. All the politicians that they're railing against were hiding in their offices and away from the college campuses. The cops had to come in and try to restore law and order. So they took it out on the police because they were the closest thing that they could rebel against at that time in terms of rebelling against the establishment. So that's a different component than what we're seeing on the street with street crimes.
But didn't that start it and it kept perpetuating to the point in which could you have ever, as a beat cop, envisioned the day where anybody would say defund the police and people would go, yeah, that sounds like the right thing to do. They got to be crazy.
Well, that's why I call them mindless. No,
but did you ever think it could ever happen? Could you have ever thought that somebody could say defund the police and people would agree with them, including politicians?
And we rally behind it. It's mind-boggling. It really is.
How do they sell that? How did they pull that one off?
Well, they use, and this is Antifa, and some of this was the Black Lives Matter movement. They use people who can't think for themselves, who haven't thought this through. They're looking to be a part of something. And so they rile them up and they stir them up and they become their foot soldiers. Okay. I fortunately, for most of my career, came to a time where the police were respected. The police were feared, for heaven's sakes. It was a healthy fear. People knew if the cop tells you to do something, do it, or there's going to be consequences. And then over time, like I said, that was at a time too where, kids in the home still respected mom, still respected dad, still respected the teacher. All that erosion of that led to this not healthy, but this total disrespect for an authority figure. Because the people I mentioned, that's what they are. They're authority figure. My dad was an authority figure. All right. The teachers carried the same authority and respect that my dad demanded, because I knew my teachers in school, they didn't have to do anything to me. All they had to do is call home, call my dad, call my mom and say, hey, had trouble with your kid in school today. And you know what my dad would do? He wouldn't take it out on the teacher like they do today. My dad would say, I'll handle it. And I knew it. So that, these people, my neighbors told me to do something. I better do it, because they knew I'll just call his house. But that's all lost. All of that is gone. And so he ends up in the lap of the police. And like I said, the police can't pass it on. The police have to do something about it.
Is there a solution? You have law enforcement at the top, law enforcement at the bottom. You have people spitting on cops and throwing stuff and rioting in the streets, looting, and the police have to stand there on stand down orders from mayors. What's the solution? How do we reverse this curse? Or can we?
It's going to be a long road back. And it's going to start with holding people accountable, and not just, the crooks. You need some help from the criminal justice system. There's no doubt about that. But you need to put a lot more pressure on the home, okay, because that's where all of this starts. Holding parents accountable to that their kid shows up in school every day. You look at the truancy rates in our urban school centers, 60 and 70%. Where's mom? Where's dad? Every time I see one of these incidents, I've had to talk about a lot of them, where a law enforcement officer had to use, a school resource officer had to use force against I won't even call them students because they're not, but an individual in the classroom. The first thing I ask when I get asked, Sheriff, how does this happen? Or could this officer have done something else? I said, my first question is, where are the parents? How come the parents weren't called instead of the police? Well, the reason the police were called because they knew the parents were not responsible, not accountable, and that they weren't going to get anything done by doing that. So I think it goes back to holding people accountable, parents, that their kids come to school prepared, keep them off the streets. And I had a curfew when I was growing up, 11, 12, 13 years old. You know what the curfew was? My dad said, when the street lights are on, your rear end better be in the house. The street lights. Yeah. So when I'm outside playing as a kid, 12, 13, I had to keep an eye on the street lights. That was the alarm. And my dad, so he didn't have to come looking for me. But see, you don't have that sort of discipline in the homes, mainly because there's no dad in the homes. Dads really, for the most part, are responsible for the socialization of their kids. They just are. Moms play a role, but it's dad. And so, some of these are social issues that government and the police don't have a solution for, even though they try. They try with this midnight basketball program and this and stuff is all socially engineered in these schools of education. There's no basis for them that they work, but it's kind of like experimentation. That's why I call it social engineer experiments. Hey, let's try this. Hey, let's try this. And then they put money after it, get a grant. And then when it doesn't work, you know what they say? Well, we're just not spending enough money. So let's do it over again with more money.
Yeah.
And the nonsense has to stop. But that's where the political leadership comes in. See, there's a lot of people here that play a role. That's where the political leadership comes in. Instead of feeding into this stuff about racism and police are the boogeyman, so on and so forth. You need responsible political leadership. How do you get that? Well, the police don't have the answer for how do you get better political leadership. But it's high time for police commanders, police administrators to start talking like I am and pushing back on the political class, saying, what do you mean we do something about it? Why don't you do something about it? Go to the prosecutor. What do you mean us? Why don't you do something about it? When mom calls the police, because I've been to these calls, you get a 12-year-old kid that won't listen at home. And I would say, what the heck are you calling me for? I said, you raised him. My mom was I was great with people and they appreciated it, for heaven's sakes. So there's a lot that has to happen. There's a lot of moving parts and it all has to happen at once. I don't know who's going to lead it. I don't have the answer for everything. You know that.
Yeah, none of us do except God. Sheriff Clarke, I've really appreciated you coming on and hanging out with me again. Please tell people about your book, Cop Under Fire, and your podcast, Straight Talk with America's Sheriff David Clarke. Tell them about the premise of the book and the show.
Sure. The book is about, it's an in-depth look at the things that you and I are talking about today. You're usually on TV and radio. You have to talk in sound bites. You don't get as much time as you're giving me today for an in-depth analysis and conversation. So, you might get 3 minutes when you're on TV. That'd be a long interview. So I did the book to give people a better insight when they said, I heard, Clarke talking about this one day, and I really wasn't sure. And I'd like to know more. Well, and get the book, Cop Under Fire. The podcast, it's the same way. It's just my take. It's one man's view. That's all it is. I don't think I'm smarter than anybody else, but I have some experiences that others don't have. That's why I mentioned my training in dignitary protection. A lot of people don't have that. And they might say, well, why didn't they do this? And why didn't they, and the same with on the street, same within our schools. And so I get to talk in depth through those platforms.
Unfiltered, no less. What are the type of topics you like to talk about?
Race, crime, and politics. It's a subtitle for my book, Cop Under Fire, Beyond Hashtags of Race, Crime, and Politics for a Better America. I'm not just a one-trick pony. It isn't all just policing. Some of these are social issues, obviously race issues, political issues. I get underestimated in those areas sometimes. People just think I'm the cop expert, and I'm pretty damn good at policing. Trust me. But, I can think about other things and break it down for people so that they better understand it. Not in terms of, I know more than you, but, well, hey, look, why do we keep trying this program that has never worked? And we've thrown, and I'll do research. We've thrown $50 million over the last 10 years on this program. And we're still here today saying, how do we fix it? Why don't we stop doing the stuff that's not working and try something new? So those platforms allow me to break that stuff down.
I hear you. And check out the podcast because he's on fire, because he's unfiltered. See, there's no 3 minutes and nobody, you don't have to look and worry about a producer of a radio show or a TV show saying you can't say that on the air, because he can say anything he wants on his podcast and he put it all in his book. Thanks for coming on with me. Please tell people how they can reach you.
Go to my website on X. It's at Sheriff Clarke, Clarke. And on Instagram and Facebook, it's some variation of at Sheriff Clarke, Clarke with an E. Just put it in the search icon there, and you'll find me on those platforms. And then you can go to americasheriff.com. That's my website.
Once again, Sheriff David Clarke, thanks for coming on. And if there were more sheriffs and patriots like you in high places, we would not be in the situation we're in. So once again, thanks for coming on. God bless you and your family.
God bless you as well. Thanks.
There you have it. Sheriff David Clarke pulls no punches. Check out his book. Check out his podcast. I want to thank America's Sheriff David Clarke for coming back on the show and giving us his opinion of what we saw. That was pretty close. And as he said, President Trump should have never even been in that situation to begin with. And law enforcement shouldn't be in the situation it is in, but this is what we're dealing with. And I think the more people that understand what the problems are from the top down, maybe we can start to find some solutions to change it. So keep speaking truth to power, Sheriff Clarke. And as I say, a lot. Don't let them grind you down. This podcast is available at radioinfluence.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Hope you subscribe to it, leave a rating and a review. The video version you can find at YouTube, Rumble, and Conservative Television of America. The same thing. Hit the notification button, subscribe, and please tell your friends about the show. If you go to radioinfluence.com, you'll find the audio archive. More than 180 high-profile guests who have been on this show several times, the likes of Peter Navarro, Judge Jeanine Pirro, Carrie Lake, Christina Bobb, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, Ben Carson, Wayne Allen Root, Nick Searcy, Carol Swain, David Horowitz, Brandon Tatum, Dick Morris, Mike Lindell, Pastor Jack Hibbs, Monica Crowley, Ann Vandersteel, Ron Vitello, Tom Holman, Clay Clarke, and Dan Wass. That's just a few. And what they had to say when they came on in the last 3 years is just as valid today. Why? Because we're in the same mess. So that's it for now, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Until the next time, this is your host, Gary Binford, saying, God bless you, God bless your families, and God, please, certainly bless America.